Okay, are we awake? I had the privilege of riding up with Slavoj, and you know, he has such an advantage. As soon as he awakens to the world, he's there. Right? So, slowly entering. Am I ready to start? Yesterday, we approached the essay sort of via the back door with the addendum. And I wanted to make one more point with regard to that addendum, and also look briefly at the epilogue before we actually enter into the text. And unless there are concerns, I'll just get started. Are there any issues? I can't deal with these sleeping patterns and these and that. Anyway, okay. Good. As I mentioned in the addendum, Heidegger is pointing to several problematic issues. And I tried to indicate one of the crucial ones, which is that he's having difficulty with the question of, you might say, the human share in art. And this will come, I think this introduces a big question for us. In some respects we could say, oh, well, he's missed it. You know, but I don't think that's quite right. I think he is working at this question in some way. And the task for us is to try to understand in what sense, in what way he's working at it. So what he actually does indicate about the human in this text, and perhaps to some extent what he doesn't. But it is, as I said, it's a problem for this essay, not in the sense that we can sort of mark a little next to a certain box and say, here's a critique of the essay, he misses this, and we're done with it. No, on the contrary, I think this introduces a really big question, a really big issue that needs to be considered as we go through. I don't have an answer on this, although I have some thoughts, but I will try to address it as we go on, and I want to put it on the table as one of the core questions. He introduces another question in these pages, which is not unrelated to the issue with which he introduced the question of the human. He said, when he uses the phrase that art is the setting into work of truth, that's from page 87 of the text. He is pointing in the Poetry, Language, and Thought, so I'm not sure what you are.
We have the other.
I guess you sent the file. Do you know where the book was from?
No, she sent both, but it wasn't her. She sent both.
No problem.
What edition that was?
I sent both.
But yeah, she sent both, but you copied it from
I
that,
copied
from the basic
from the basic writings. Okay, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure which.
Okay.
My fault for that page.
Well, let me just go on. We don't need to focus on this because that's fine.
Did you send it in the mail?
Do you need a copy?
Oh, I did not get it. Did you get it for your
Well, in the paragraph preceding the one in which he introduces the question of the human, he says that in art we're concerned with the setting into work of truth. And you'll remember I was pointing out that the problem here is that this could be understood as an act on the part of truth itself, which turns truth into a kind of subject, or it could be understood as something that is done to truth. Right? So either subjective or objective genitive in that phrase. It could go either way. And Heidegger clearly wants it to go both ways, in some sense. But at the heart of this concern is the problem of setting in place, or setting up and fixing. And this is, in many respects, this really is the core issue of this text. And we'll see Heidegger talk about this in the very first pages. It's the core issue because Heidegger is trying to grasp in this text one of the ways in which truth occurs. And when I use this phrase truth occurs, I'm really trying to emphasize the historical character of this event. He's trying to emphasize that there's a historicity of truth. Truth is not something that is timeless. On the contrary, it happens for Heidegger in, speaking very quickly, in epochs, at least within the history of being. These are epical moments. And it happens in each case in different ways. We might say different modalities, but we have to be careful with such words. But in any case, the event of truth in the Greek world is not the same as the event of truth in the Middle Ages or in modernity. And the way truth occurs in each moment of its occurrence is let's just say particular. Now, the question is, well, Heidegger will tell us in the course of the essay that truth occurs in 5 different ways. Art is just one way in which truth occurs. And one of the issues in the text is, why does truth happen in art? And what does it mean that truth happens in art? What is it about art that makes it an appropriate place for the event of truth, for truth to appropriate itself in a way? Why is art one of the proper sites for the occurrence of truth at some time, in some times? And I use that phrase in some times because as we get to the epilogue, he's going to ask, is it true today? And that's a core question in this text. Can we say that truth is needed today, or art is needed today for the event of truth? But in some epochs, and certainly in the Greek epoch, in his interpretation, truth occurred in art. And in this he agrees with Hegel. Truth occurred in art. And the question is, well, what does that mean? What about art made it a suitable site for the occurrence of truth? Over and over in this text, he'll tell us it has something to do with the earth, with what he calls earth. And so for some reason I say this over and over, one of the core issues in this text is how we are to understand the place of earth in the event of truth. And it is something of a mystery, something that is really very hard to establish. So, he's talking about truth instantiating itself in a particular site, in a particular time, in an earthly context. I'm avoiding the word material for reasons that we'll see. But he wants to understand how this happens in art, insofar as art is a singular. Again, I'm hesitating over words because he'll start out saying it's not a thing exactly. it's a singular composition, a singular a creation, I suppose you could say. And he wants to ask, what is the nature of truths being fixed in that site, being set up there, being established there? And again, I want to insist upon the way in which it is, in some sense, pinned down and established in a particular site. What is the nature of that establishing, that fixing, that definition of truth in a particular site? Again, because truth is, in traditional, usually in most understandings of it, it has something of a transcendental character, it has something of a timeless character. It is not historically defined. But Heidegger is also trying to avoid what has become more popular in recent decades, which is a constructivist notion of truth, whereby truth would be something produced by human beings within a particular time and place and with particular determinations, socio-political determinations, cultural determinations, material determinations, and so forth. He's not producing a constructivist view of art. And that's why he wants to hold on to this ambiguity in the phrase that art is the setting into work of truth. Because truth is both subject and object. If it were simply object, then we would have a constructivist notion, that art would be determining truth for a people and a time, and defining its traits. He doesn't want to surrender truth to human doing in that way, or to human production. Truth is not a function of production. At the same time, it's not simply a transcendental in the traditional sense of the term. So it is. He wants to understand how, within a very particular artifact in a particular place, something made, right? Something crafted, something created. How this determinate site could become precisely a site for truth, which exceeds human control or human mastery or human determination. Truth is, in this respect, to use a phrase that Geste'll introduced in time, it's a quasi-transcendental. It's something of a transcendental, but not quite transcendental. But then the issue is, again, how do we understand this instantiation, this instance of determination, which doesn't make truth a product, but lets it occur as truth for this time and for this place. And he is trying to understand how this setting of truth is to be distinguished from somewhat the metaphysics of modernity understands as a placing or a positing of truth. And in this, he's trying to avoid basically the idealist notion of truth as something posited. He's trying to avoid a notion of Setzung, position. And above all, the idea that truth would be something posited by a subject for itself. He's trying to avoid the metaphysics of subjectivity. So, he wants to understand how the human doing sets forth and sets up truth, but doesn't turn truth into a posited thing. So he tells us then that truth is placed or set up, and he's working with the word stellen there, placing, putting. And he offers, as he tells us, I'm backing up a little bit in this addendum. He says he uses to capture the whole setup, the whole framing that occurs here. He uses to capture this movement the term Geste'll. Now, when Heidegger writes, many of you don't have that in front of you, so I'll just write it down. I'll let you try to answer what that is. I wish my 2-year-old were here. He would tell you exactly what Geste'll. There's the root of stellen, place, right? Good. Heidegger. Well, this is a very typical instance of Heideggerian writing. Geste'll is usually as a frame, like or you set up a bookshelf or something, right? A shelf. But he divides the word and brings forth this prefix. And when Heidegger brings forth the ge in that manner, he's stressing the way in which there's an assembling, or gathering together, or pulling together. So he likes to talk about in the mountains, the Gebirge. There's a certain drawing together of the peaks in the mountain landscape. But anyway, this is what brings together, what gathers together, and in this entire process of setting out and setting forth, or framing. Okay? Now the difficulty here is this is the exact same word that he will use in the 50s and 60s to describe technology. And the whole point of this meditation on art, as he goes forward, and if you read the question concerning technology, you'll see this very clearly. The whole point of meditation on art is to understand, is to find a way of understanding a kind of making or creating a kind of poiesis, which does not fall within the order of technique, which is itself a framing and a setting up for the purposes of exploitation exploitation of resources. So we have this, and he's very, he doesn't hesitate to confront the problem. He says, yes, this is the exact same word for what I'm trying to think against. And there's the mystery. How do we understand the relation between poiesis and techne? And can we draw forth in our understanding of techne and poiesis something that escapes the contemporary or modern order of technology, which is the governing order for our relation to beings in modernity. Excuse me. So the issue then, as I say, is how do we understand a setting out or a setting forth in art, which is not a positing and not reducible to any kind of representation in the sense of a Vorstellung. How do we understand this this relation to something set up in a way that escapes the metaphysics of subjectivity and hence the relation between subject and object? And the meditation on art, which will follow here, is is constantly trying to invite us to rethink that relation. So again, this takes us to the question of the human. How the artist relates to the event that occurs in his or her act of making or creating, and then as he comes to the end of the essay, how the one who responds to or undergoes the experience of the artwork, how that one engages with the work in a way that is both being taken into the work and at the same time an active engagement and in some way a participation in the creation. In both cases, Heidegger will describe an extremely dynamic process, and it will never be reducible to a simple subject-object relation. And particularly when it comes to the appreciation of the artwork, he does not see our relation to art as being one of relating to some object there before us, which is either moving us, in terms of our emotions or our feelings or our sensitivity, or engaging us in some sort of intellectual manner, and representing a concept, for example, as in some conceptual way. So, this is introducing all sorts of problems and issues. He's trying to suggest, how do we think the presence of this thing in a way that escapes the idea of a posited object? How do we think the presence of that thing, and how do we think our relation to that presence? How do we think the relation that is both the creative act and the creative act of receiving? How do we think that in a way that escapes the positing that is active in the metaphysics of subjectivity? Okay? And how do we think of this instantiation, in the sense that there is this quasi-transcendental, this truth, which is occurring in a finite place, in a determinate site, just a material site, earthly site? How can we understand that fixing And how do we understand that fixing in such a way as to keep it from being something like an objectification, or a signification, or any kind of determination that reduces truth to something that is simply an object for our understanding or our feeling.
Chris?
Yeah, I just want to finish. Well, that's okay. I'll come back to it. Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll just let him. Thank you. This is twice you've been displaced today. Go ahead.
It seems like the concept of truth is bearing a lot of weight with the theory. Is there, it might be helpful to have some kind of, not necessarily the nature of truth, but a rough outline of.
We'll be coming to it. It's it's at the center of the essay. He starts to develop the notion. In the very, but it's useful to say something now because I'm referring to it a great deal. Truth is to be thought here as a kind of opening, an opening and appearing. It's the opening of the relation that we have to things or to ourselves. The opening in the sense that it both opening in the sense of a kind of a parity, or kind of literally a kind of opening, or a clearing, as it's sometimes said, and a manifesting of some kind, so that things are made evident or manifest or given to us in some way. In this, he is drawing from the Greek aletheia, when the a is there as a privative for lethe, for hiddenness or concealedness or a forgetting of some kind. And so, as he understands it, aletheia is an unconcealment. So this making manifest or making evident of our relation to what is an unconcealing. But at the same time, there is in this unconcealing also a play of concealment. So it's concealment and unconcealment at the same time. It's really truth. I'm using the word in the way he's using it here as a kind of shorthand, because it's the truth of the being of what is, or the truth of essence. And so we need to distinguish a little bit between this opening, making evident, or this manifestness, and what is made manifest. And what I was saying a moment ago, I was saying it's the manifestness of the relation that we have to things, which is defined by the being of what is. So, but he uses, as I said, this as a kind of shorthand for this entire event by which things are given to us, or we are given a relation to ourselves.
Since it's a function of concealment, it has a kind of a contingent nature to it.
Not contingent, essential. Concealment is part of truth.
But if it has to do with unveiling or disclosing, it's contingent on how it is veiled or how it is hidden.
Yeah. You might say its way of unveiling is always a function of what veiling is involved in it.
So in that sense, it has a kind of contingent nature to it. Because you can hide things in many different ways, and then they would have to be disclosed in.
He comes back to this quite explicitly.
Okay.
But for our purposes right now, truth is this way in which, as he describes it here, the way in which a world is given to us. In the way in which a world is given to us. In an earthly sight, and in an earthly way. And it's really critical for him that you cannot distinguish world and earth. So, and this truth is the articulation of world and earth, and the way in which they are brought into relation and brought forth in this relation. So, it is truth, using this kind of shorthand, is that event by which we have relation in general. All relation. Relation to ourselves, as selves, relation to other human beings, as selves, and relation to the things with which we interact in the world. And the world in the sense that we live in a kind of totality, a place in which we are to some extent at home, but at the same time to some extent feeling uneasy in that we're not quite at home. That totality is what is given to us by truth. So the mystery of this mystery, or the challenge that he's trying to point to with this question of the instantiation of truth in a finite sight is, how do we think the occurrence of truth, which gives us relation in general, from a finite sight? You see what I'm saying? If even our relation to the artwork is a function of truth, how can we understand truth to be occurring in that thing? I'll come back to this in various ways, but what's mysterious about the artwork, he's saying, is the artwork gives us the means to relate to it. It's not that, the artwork is a thing among things. The artwork is that event by which we can have a relation to the artwork, or anything else. Right? So, and that's why the quasi-transcendental is so mysterious. Right? This thing is giving the possibility of relation to things. Or changing that possibility.
Something like paradigm in Kuhn's sense?
Paradigm to a certain extent. We'll see that. He says that there is a guiding form in the artwork.
And framing?
Framing in the sense of paradigm, that works a little bit like that. But it is, that's not quite enough, I would say. Because you have to capture this sense of opening. You have to capture this spatio-temporal relationality, which is being...
So you are saying that paradigm is closed, relatively?
Well, I think of a paradigm as almost a kind of defining schema for, as almost a measure, so to speak. And yes, you might say that this is what the artwork is giving us, but we have to then, we have to bring in the whole... all of the dimensions of this, right? The spatio-temporal dimensions, this relation to the earth, the relation to forgetting, and I mean, it's so paradigm is really very.
It's a shorthand like that. It's the possibility of changing a paradigm.
Yes, well, that is yes, and that's what art is doing. That's what this event is doing. You could say it's like a paradigm shift. When art occurs, a paradigm shift has occurred. But I think that the paradigm, as Kuhn describes it, is not quite sufficient to talk about what the totality of being that Heidegger is trying to capture.
It seems like he keeps going from unity to duality. Is that sort of like a dance in the language, or the unity of the work of art, but then he needs duality in order to interpret what it is?
Heidegger, yes. Well, Heidegger's working primarily with duality here. Later on, he'll speak with a fourfold. And there are four components at play. The unity is a unity of movement, and it's a unity of, it's a dynamic held together in some respect. So it's not unified in the sense of it's not dialectically unified, and it's not unified in the sense of an englobing or a totalized whole. It's rather dynamic.
But couldn't it help if you would describe the work of art as a unity?
It is a kind of unity. It has a self-contained character. It is a kind of unity. But you want to be very careful not to fall into a very traditional notion of unity in the artwork, because then that's what a symbol is. Right? A symbol is a unified form which has in the Greek sense, realizes a coalescence of meaning and materiality, and that's what the paradigm of Greek, the perfect sculpture realizes that unity of meaning and form in a way that sort of set the standard for aesthetics for many years, and that's a unity of a very peculiar kind, a very important kind. And Heidegger is trying to stay away from that.
But also, what about the mystical? I mean, to go back to the Greek, the eros gamos, this connection between heaven and earth. Why is that left out in this language, the cosmic?
It's not left out at all. But, we'll be seeing him refer to the sky and the earth, and in the fourfold that I'm talking about, it's also gods and mortals and so on and so forth. So you got all you want there in those respects.
Okay.
Can I ask you how it happens, like what is the work of art in which it happens? I mean, the work of art, as Heidegger talks about, it's like a Van Gogh drawing or painting or whatever, right? And we have access to it through very specialized contexts in which we participate in the work of art. But how is he using the work of art in general in terms of obviously access to truth? It's not simply for a bunch of us people who are art specialists, but is available to all, presumably, or to those who are open to truth in whatever its form. So I guess I'm wondering, what this notion of the work of art is, and why he's using this and how specific it is.
That's what this essay is about. I can give you a quick answer, but that's what we're trying to get to. That's the issue.
Okay.
What is the work of art? What is the work of art if, and we'll get to this very quickly at the beginning, what is the work of art if it's not equipment, if it's not a tool, if it's not like, a thing that serves our purposes in some way? Right?
So is a hammer, a well-made hammer, a well-designed hammer, a work of art?
No.
Okay.
Excuse me.
But I'm not going to go into hammers at this point.
Just one question. You said that there is an articulation, like truth is the articulation between word and earth.
Yes.
Like without any articulation, how do we define word and earth? Like what is word and what is
Well,
earth?
we'll come to that. But I want to emphasize that you cannot think the one without the other. That's critical here. If you divorce them, then you miss the dynamics, the very possibility of the dynamics of this play that he sees set in motion in the work of art. So, as we go forward, we have to separate, analytically, and so we'll come to that very shortly. But I want to hold off. I don't want to anticipate everything, otherwise you'll get bored and the whole thing's up. But anyway.
Can I ask for a linguistic? Well, I think I misheard something. It's not a question of thing. Did you say earthy or earthly?
I don't remember. I may have said either. I'm sorry.
Either, okay. Is it something with Boden in the German?
Well, sometimes he'll use Boden, but here it's Erde.
Oh, okay.
I mean, Boden's a very charged word in this.
Well, that's why I thought
But he does use it sometimes.
Okay.
Let me get to the first question.
I'll ask after a second.
Why?
Okay.
Something way back.
All right. So, I was trying to bring forth this fundamental question here with this idea of setting. How do we understand the possibility of fixing in place that quasi-transcendental, that event that gives us relation in general, including relation to that thing in which it is fixed in place? Okay? The more you think about it, the more you realize this is really imponderable. And you'll see throughout this essay a series of articulations, circular articulations. And I'll point this out to you. But this can get very dense. The more you follow it, the more you see this gets some very tight versions of what he calls the hermeneutic circle. Because he will say the truth needs art to set itself up as truth. How can you make such a statement? Right? There is no truth before it's set up, but it needs the artwork in order to set itself up, and so on and so forth. And this is what he will be turning through over and over, and it is all about this this possibility of articulating truth in a finite set. Ultimately, that articulation will be understood as a kind of fugal articulation. I'm sorry?
Futile?
Fugal, as in a fugue.
Oh, sorry, I was like, what?
So, that's when you get a chance to read the addendum, maybe you could make copies of the addendum and the epilogue for everybody for next time.
Email them both.
Is that,
Or just email them.
No, they weren't included.
They weren't included.
that email?
I like how.
So then let's go to the epilogue now quickly. Let's get to the epilogue. I'm going to read this to you since many of you don't have it in front of you. And it is important, so we need to look at this. The foregoing reflections are concerned with the riddle of art. I've been pointing to this riddle so far. The riddle that art itself is. They are far, this is page 79 in the Poetry and Language and Thought, Basic Writings. This is 204. 204. Almost from the time when specialized thinking about art and the artist began, this thought was called aesthetic. Aesthetics takes the work of art as an object, the object of aesthesis, of sensuous apprehension in the wide sense. Today we call this apprehension experience. I don't have the, oh there it is. I don't have that immediately in front of me, but I believe that's Erlebnis, which is very important here. Today we call this apprehension experience. The way in which man experiences art is supposed to give information about its nature. Experience is the source that is standard not only for art appreciation and enjoyment, but also for artistic creation. Everything is an experience. Yet perhaps experience is the element in which art dies. The dying occurs so slowly that it takes a few centuries.
Sorry, may I interrupt? Is it? I have in my text lived experience. Is kind of
Yes, the translator is trying to get to the idea of Erlebnis versus Erfahrung. And I will write that on the board for you.
Do you think Heidegger is sort of reading Spengler in this, like the decline and things like that?
Well, it's just in the back. Erlebnis. Erlebnis is, again, it's lived experience, and how can I say, it's feeling in a almost the everyday sense. Right? We associate with Californian aesthetics, certain touchy-feely relationality, right? That's Erlebnis. I feel this work of art. Get in touch with your feelings. That's Erlebnis, right? And everything that pervades all life today, right? It starts in California. It starts in California, will someday take over the world. But believe it or not, it happened before California. It happened in Germany, at least. But it is. I'm being a little bit trivializing, but again, Heidegger is trying to delimit in all respects the metaphysics of subjectivity. And subjectivity, one of the ways in which this omnipresence of a reference to the subject manifests itself is in this attention to Erlebnis, coming from the Romantic period forward, in this focus on the individual's experience in the sense of feelings or sensibility. There's possibly lurking here, but I'm not sure to what extent this would be the case, a reference to Kant's interpretation, Kant's taking up of the aesthetic tradition proceeding from Baumgarten. But the Kantian reference is very problematic here. I'm pausing over this because there's quite a lot of controversy over what Heidegger is attacking exactly. certainly Kant understands our relation to the beautiful, and to some extent our experience of the sublime, as one that involves Erlebnis. But this is a very peculiar kind of experience of reflection in Kant. And I don't think it can be reduced simply to what he's calling Erlebnis here. That's why I made the joke about a Californian sensibility. Kant is talking about when we experience beauty in an object, or an art object, or a natural occurrence. What we experience in art, this moves us into a feeling of a harmony of our state of understanding and our sensibility. And the imagination is experiencing a kind of a free play, which is the freedom of its faculties working together. Right? And so we experience in beauty, in a certain sense, we experience almost an ideal relationality within our own faculties of understanding and feeling. So the human being comes into its own to a certain extent in the feeling of beauty. There's more involved here than simply a feeling. Right? There is an interplay of understanding, imagination, and sensibility, which is as an ideal character. In the sublime, there's something else going on. There's an incommensurability experienced, and even a certain violence. And again, this is to reduce this to feeling in the sense of Erlebnis would be somewhat problematic. This involves a play of the imagination and the reason, and a certain violence exercised there by which we feel our exalted human status, or even to some extent our participation in something divine. So the Kantian reference here would be, I think, a bit problematic. But this is a very important question, because you have to ask, what is his relation to Kant, who is the determining figure for thinking about aesthetics in the German tradition? You notice that Kant barely appears in this text, which is very, very interesting. I'm going to come back to this issue, because Kant understands this play of the relation between understanding and sensibility as one involving a play of schematism. The schematism of the imagination. And I suspect that there's a lot of schematism going on in this text in various ways. But he wants to attack here an understanding of aesthetics which stresses an experience in the sense of feeling. And so the important thing about art, in that understanding of art, is how it makes us feel, right? Or the artist expressing his or her feelings. In either case, we would have the creative process, in some sense, made answerable to the artist's emotions or feelings or sensibility, or artistic sensibility, various ways in which one might construe this. Heidegger saying that, no, this is, actually, I don't know what's catching here. This is far too short a way of understanding what's going on in art. Art is an ontological event. In Heidegger's view, art is an event which involves truth, not simply an individual's feelings and all the vagaries and contingencies involved in that. So, Erlebnis is lived experience. I'm trying to get this experience of a subject and an individual. Erfahrung is something of a different matter. Erfahrung is, well, the root in here, fahren, suggests a traveling, or a movement, or a passage. And Heidegger is also hearing in this Gefahr, which is danger. So there is a passage that involves some sort of risk, or some sort of mortal danger. Right? So there's something like an experience of death that might be involved. And Heidegger is very interested always in prefixes, going back to the Sanskrit. This one suggests some sort of a movement. He's setting underway. So Erfahrung is an undergoing of an experience, which suggests that the subject of that experience is in some way taken over, or taken through, or is at grips with something larger and other than itself. So Erfahrung is is an experience. Well, in Erfahrung we know a certain finitude. We know the finitude of ourselves as subject. Whereas in Erlebnis we feel full of ourselves in feeling, right? In that, what I'm ridiculing is the Californian sensibility. There is actually, as opposed to a sense of being exposed to alterity, and possibly some sort of mortal danger, there is a kind of narcissistic satisfaction and a kind of support of the subject, a support of one's ego or pleasure. So he wants to, excuse me, he wants to take art out of this sphere of subjective experience, individual experience, sensibility, and try to address it insofar as it involves an event where something like truth is at stake, and the subject itself is at stake. Excuse me. So, right here he suggests that he's putting the emphasis on the word, on the Greek word aesthesis, which suggests the sensibility. And the attack on aesthetics that's in this text might be understood as an attack on that, that sort of all-governing reference to sensibility, which is characteristic of art criticism or thinking about art. But we'll come to see that he defines aesthetics slightly differently in the course of the text. And so I'm trying to, in some sense, bracket this. It's very important what he's saying here. But I don't think we should take this as the sort of governing concern in this essay. You might want to revisit what I'm saying. I'm overstating, but I've just been reading something that does take this as the governing concern in the essay, and I'm troubled by that, so I'm pausing a bit. He goes on, to be sure, people speak of immortal works of art and of art as an eternal value. Speaking this way means using that language which does not trouble with precision in all essential matters, for fear that in the end, to be precise, would call for thinking. This is an attack on the notion of values, which is also very great concern to him in his reading of Nietzsche. And I continue, is there any greater fear today than that of thinking? Does this talk about immortal works and the eternal value of art have any content or substance? Or are these merely the half-baked cliches of an age when great art, together with its nature, has departed from among men? So he's attacking the notion that art would be enshrined among those cultural values. That is a fairly common way of talking about it. In the most comprehensive reflection on the nature of art that the West possesses, comprehensive because it stems from metaphysics, namely Hegel's Vorlesung über die Ästhetik, the following propositions occur, and this is quite crucial. First proposition, art no longer counts for us as the highest manner in which truth obtains existence for itself. Hegel's argument is that basically philosophy has supplanted that position. The period in which art was the site for the manifestation of truth is over, in short. I'm not going to go into Hegel's whole history of art, but Hegel is basically saying that thought has overtaken art as this site in which truth reveals itself in its fullest and highest form. So, art no longer, that first one, art no longer counts for us as the highest manner in which truth obtains existence for itself. Again, a very important phrase, obtains existence for itself. Again, there's that question of where is it real? Where does it happen? Where is it material in a strong sense? Second point, one may well hope that art will continue to advance and perfect itself, but its form has ceased to be the highest need of the spirit. Spirit no longer needs art for its relation to truth. Okay? Again, that's Hegel. In all these relationships, art is and remains for us on the side of its highest vocation, something past. Its glory was in Greece. It had a few good moments in the Middle Ages. It's over. The judgment that Hegel passes in these statements cannot be evaded by pointing to the fact that there's been good art since, and so forth. The question that Heidegger wants to ask, I'm not going to go through all this. The question what Heidegger wants to ask is this judgment still, does it still stand? can we accept this statement that art is no longer of, not just need, but of the highest need for spirit, and that it is not no longer the site where truth occurs in its most telling manner, let's say. Heidegger is, he is, it's pretty clear what his answer is. He thinks that we precisely need art today for a relation to truth. And for, in some respect, for a recovery of the human itself. A recovery of the human essence. So it is of the highest importance to us, and it is one of our highest needs, because the spirit, he uses this word very cautiously, but sometimes uses it. Art is one of the greatest needs for spirit in Heidegger's view. And part of what happens in the 30s is he begins, he sort of identifies this need, and he turns to Nietzsche to some extent in order to try to think it through. But even more important than for Heidegger than Nietzsche is Hölderlin, and he sees Hölderlin as the poet which will help the Germans find themselves in their historical destiny. And again, the issue is art. He's trying to prepare for the advent of the kind of art that Hölderlin was seeking. The person I'm speaking of is Friedrich Hölderlin, who was a classmate of Hegel and Schelling. Not just a classmate, they shared a room together for several years, which is, the more you get to know these characters, the more mind-boggling that is. They were in Tübingen together. So, let me just read just a little bit in the next paragraph, and then we'll finish this epilogue. The question remains, is art still an essential and necessary way in which truth happens, which is decisive for our historical existence? Or is art no longer of this character? If, however, it is such no longer, then there remains the question why this is so. The truth of Hegel's judgment has not yet been decided. For behind this verdict there stands Western thought since the Greeks, which thought corresponds to a truth of beings that has already happened. Decision upon the judgment will be made, when it is made, from and about this truth of what is. Until then, the judgment remains in force. But for that very reason, the question is necessary whether the truth that the judgment declares is final and conclusive, and what follows if it is. One thing he's making very clear in this statement, I mean, it's quite a statement, right? This is, the stakes couldn't be higher from a philosophical point of view. But he's saying that this essay about art is an essay about art and truth, right? And so it's important to keep this in mind in this essay. This is an essay about art. It says a lot about the artwork, and some things you might struggle with, other things you might find revelatory, but in many respects, this is not an essay about art, right? This is about art and truth, and it is a philosophical statement in the strongest sense. I mean, he set the stakes very high. Is art, is it or is it not the site where truth occurs and is determinative for our historical existence? And when he says historical existence, he means as a people, in a state, in this time and place. So for Heidegger, excuse me, this is what's at stake here is the destiny of the West, for whom or for which Heidegger sees Germany playing a central role. You should read for this the Introduction to Metaphysics, which is written around the same time as the final version of this, where Heidegger lays out the role of Germany in its fulfillment or non-fulfillment of the Western destiny in relation to what he identifies as American pragmatism and Russian Bolshevism. he describes Germany as in a pincers between America and Russia, and the issue is whether Germany will call up its tradition in such a way as to make that tradition live forward, in the German destiny, or whether it will fail and in some sense die under the pressure of these two forces. So it is, and he's saying, he's asking the question whether art has a crucial place in this determination of the Western history. So, okay. It sounds a little too serious to get started, but that's, we do have to appreciate what he is trying to do, and we have to, I think, in some sense, reading Heidegger, he's really quite serious. This is really quite serious. He was willing to condone fascism, in the form of Nazism, to realize this. So this is not speculative play. This is not it's not an academic exercise. It is something very chillingly serious. Marcus?
Could one argue that this is Heidegger's most explicitly political text? Because he gave the lecture in Zurich. You didn't even feel comfortable enough to give that.
I'm sorry,
could one argue this is Heidegger's most explicitly political text? Because he gave this lecture in Zurich, not in Germany.
Yeah, I can't remember the sites in which he gave it, but he did give it in Germany.
I thought in 36 or 37 it was in Zurich.
This is where I have really a terrible memory for these kinds of things. I must have read that 50 times, but I don't remember.
Yeah.
So, but let me get to the core of your question there, which is this: is this a political text? This is a very important question. Heidegger says in this essay there are 5 ways in which truth occurs. One of them is art, another is politics. Art and politics are not the same thing. Another is thought. He is constantly trying to use his language in such a way as to make truth happen in his language. So, to say, is this a political text, would be contradicted by what he's saying here. This is not a political text. It is a text of thought about art, but talking about art in its place, in its place for a people, in a nation, in a historical framework. So it depends how you're using the word politics, and I think that one very important question that this text raises is how do we think about the political? It could be that in this essay, Heidegger is trying to draw forth dimensions of, let's just say, experience, which do not surrender to political determination. And that, in some respects, what he's trying to describe would constitute a limit for political thinking. I suspect that would be the case with the Earth. That the Earth cannot surrender to a political, evaluation. One can always come back, and say, well, but come on, you're being mystified. This is a political gesture. Yes, of course, to some extent, and that the similar argument can be made. Well, but surely you recognize that this is very metaphysical. It's caught up in a tradition. This language is totally overdetermined, not only by the German aesthetic tradition, but even by the contemporary Nazi parlance and so on. Yes, of course. And Heidegger is always very explicit about this. He cannot escape his time and place or his language. And so the project of thinking and writing is to try to work at the limits, to constantly try to break free of these kinds of determinations, all the while recognizing there is no such thing as escaping completely. So, yes, it's political in that sense. But if we take seriously what he's saying about truth and truth, art, and thought, and politics, then we have to entertain the possibility that what he's trying to bring forth here is cannot be subsumed in a political, let's just say a political discourse, or cannot be subsumed as having essentially a political meaning. I guess that's the best way of putting it. You see? And this this is a very important point for me, because I have been, well, I was talking about the way in which in cultural theory and particularly identity politics in the United States, one of the, there are troubling assumptions there about identity, first of all, and ethnicity and culture. To me, these are very problematic terms as they're mobilized in cultural theory and identity politics. But what is more troubling still, in my view, is the implicit assumption that everything is political. That runs through almost all appeals to identity politics. And it's that kind of assumption that would make one say, well, but Chris, come on, obviously this is a political gesture, it's political. Well, yes, of course, to a certain extent, to a certain limit, yes. But what's interesting here, perhaps, is that limit. And I think that one of the real tasks for thinking today is to try to think the limits of the political. I find myself increasingly, I have found myself increasingly over the past couple decades, talking to my students about the way in which the imperative of being political overdetermines almost everything in the contemporary academy and in the humanities in particular. And it's again with the assumption that everything is political. There's an idea that you have to be political in order to say something that counts. If your doctoral thesis or if your publication doesn't have political import, then it's of marginal importance, and it's probably going to screw up your possibility, your professional possibilities. Right? To say something important, it must be political. You must draw forth the political meaning of what you're saying, because otherwise it won't have meaning. Well, there you have this sense that everything is political, sort of over-determining all meaning, right? Any kind of significance. And that is a totalizing gesture. Right? It means that the englobes all meaning and all experience. If you then over-determine that argument with ideas about ethnicity, culture, and identity, then you have a kind of totalitarianism. You have a totalizing construction of experience. And you lose, potentially, everything that Heidegger is trying to point to here, first of all, with this notion of the earth, which is a lot. Suddenly I've got Olympia Dukakis in my mind from Moonstruck, where she says, what you don't know about women is a lot. My concern with this construction that all is political is that a great deal of human experience is reduced, is foreclosed. And a great deal of political, questions relating to the political is foreclosed. And that, I go back to what I was saying about the liberal construction of fascism and Nazism and so forth. So I want to be extremely careful with how I, personally, I'm saying this is important to me in my work and my thinking. I want to be very careful with how I use the term political. I consider myself very politically oriented. Politics is very important to everything I do, but I want to be very careful about what I understand to be political. And I'm particularly interested in understanding those places where forms of experience exceed the order of what we call politics, or even the political. And I'll probably talk about this in relation to Blanchot. What Blanchot calls community is not political. It exceeds the order of the political. So I just urge, one of the reasons the exercise of reading Heidegger, as I said, Heidegger is reprehensible in many ways, particularly in this period. But I think to deal with him, you have to be precise. And if you want to do it productively, or productively is not a word I like there, but if you want to really draw something from this, And to go forward in a questioning way, you have to be extremely precise. And that's why I like this text in some respects. It really demands, you can't be comfortable with this text. You know, you could read Benjamin, you'd be a lot more comfortable. Benjamin is a good guy. I think he's a bad guy. You have to be extremely careful. I'm being crude, but you understand what I'm trying to say. I've been telling my students for the last couple of decades, if you want to be political, don't be political. And I hold to that very strongly, precisely because you must be political in the contemporary academic world in order to have a place. And that's a very problematic assumption.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
In relation to politics and language, is Heidegger in kind of trying to go back to the radical of language and sort of clear it out and sort of build up an under foundation and then sort of the building of being or whatever, or the house of being or whatever.
Well, he is interested in clearing out of it. Yeah.
So and then reinvesting in a language of the folk and maybe is he not also saying like this is the foundation of a new politics, and in terms of like maybe something Habermas might create communicative action out of sort of a Heideggerian idea of language leading to politics. Would that be?
Well, you see, there's so many. There's an awful lot in the question, which has to do with the politics of language. And Heidegger doesn't think of this process of engaging with language as one of recovering a more primordial language, as though there would be a language of the tribe which would be more true or pure. It really is in Heidegger something more like it is a kind of deconstruction, in the sense that he is trying to loosen up and to some extent destroy those elements in our language which are overladen with, I might just say, dead forms, because in a certain sense metaphysics is over, right? Metaphysics is dead in his view. And remember, he talks about the death of art here when you start talking about experience. So he's trying to, in a certain sense, break that up, destroy it, but in order to release a relation to what is still speaking in language. And in that relation, one has to be creative, to use the word a little bit too easily. You have to draw out what is latent and has never been said. You have to draw it out. You have to write it. You have to bring it forward. And this is so in Heidegger. There's always this requirement of an active interpretation or an active writing. It's not as though there's something latent, true, primordial, originary, lying at the ground that we have to simply bring to the surface. There has to be this kind of destructive movement and then a bringing forth of what has never quite been there, and has then written out. With the question of aletheia, he says that in the Greeks never understood their own word. There has never been an aletheia in the sense of concealment and unconcealment in the way he draws it out. It never happened in Greek thought, but it was there. It was latent in a sense, and so Heidegger is making it happen in modernity using the Greek terms. So in that sense, you have to be very careful accusing Heidegger of etymologism, saying that he thinks there is a true root there which can be drawn out, and then we can get to a more authentic kind of parlance. No, he's just using etymology to allow, in a certain sense, to allow language to inspire him, and then to work with it. So some of his etymologies are kind of problematic, and he knows that. There's a moment in the language essays where he says, "What I am thinking with the word way, Weg, is what is meant in Tao." Right? And then he sort of suggests that we look at the etymologies. Well, if you look at the etymologies, they have nothing to do with one another. So how can they be the same word? He suggests. Well, they're the same in his way of working with them. Right? But it's not because the etymology allows this. Right? Yeah. So it's. I think he's demonstrated to us that this is not etymology at that moment, and that's very important. So yes, there is a you might say, a politics of language use going on here, because this is all about trying to, it's inviting a people to really grasp its destiny through what he calls a style in this period. So it is a particular, well, use of art and language which is called for. But it's not as though there is something, true at the base, which could then be drawn out. This has to be worked for in a way. Okay.
Can I ask what that?
Yeah.
When you say style, is he's putting out there the Germans find their style that connects them to their destiny and also their heritage?
Yeah.
Because I have to bring up, talking about Nazism, triumph of the will and the aesthetic that created. That I think in art really has only been looked at recently. Leni Rosenthal's aesthetic that she creates through her, the film about the Olympics and the Nazi Party Congress in 1936, Triumph of the Will. Is that anything that he was, the fact is an aesthetic came through that film.
Well,
and it
again,
was totally backed by Hitler.
His attack on aesthetics here is very important in this respect. He is, and again, this takes us back to the question of unity and totality. Heidegger would be very critical of that kind of mobilization of the masses within an aesthetic construction. Now, I'm on very dangerous ground here. This is very important and very complex. When I use the word style, I'm drawing directly from his Nietzsche lectures. I think they're 1935-36. The Nietzsche lectures are in 4 volumes, and they're published in 2 books. But in the first volume, he offers this rather chilling sentence. I don't have it with me, but he says, Hölderlin and Nietzsche placed before the German people the question of, he uses a phrase something like historical style. He says that they've sort of presented with the German people with a cipher, question. Will we grasp what is at stake in this question and achieve this style or not? I'm not giving you a very precise quotation, but what is that style? He's talking about the way in which both Nietzsche and Hölderlin, Nietzsche after Hölderlin, recognized in the Greek, in Greek art, in Greek culture, using this word in a very broad sense, a fundamental division. Hölderlin said, I'm going to come back to this, Hölderlin said that more or less pointed to a dimension of Greek experience that exceeded the aesthetic appropriation of Greek art in 19th century German aesthetics. And basically Hölderlin was saying, you've missed the ecstatic religious side, the Dionysian. Nietzsche's Dionysian really is it's not clear how much he knew about Hölderlin's own remarks on this, but Hölderlin was very specific in saying, you have in the Greek culture both a precision in representation, and that's what we have come to associate with Greek art, with the temples, with the perfect symbolic forms of the statuary and so forth. You have that precision in form, he says, which is characteristically modern, and then you have at the same time this somewhat suppressed element of Dionysian ecstasis, religious frenzy, and a kind of a holy pathos, he calls it. Nietzsche then took that over with his notion of the Apollinian and the Dionysian. And Nietzsche was trying, in some sense, to call us to the Dionysian. Right? He's reminding us that Greek art is not simply about Apollo, because that's what Euripides looked at, and all he could stand was Apollo. But he couldn't handle the Sophoclean awareness of the Dionysian dimension, let alone the more ancient forms. So Heidegger says that Nietzsche and Hölderlin, in understanding this split in the Greek heritage, and in demanding that we moderns engage that division in our modern way, that is the question that's being offered to the Germans. So what is the relation then between holy pathos and sober representation, to use the Hölderlinian phrase? How will we moderns realize this conflictual relation between a precise form and an ecstatic transcendence? And that, if we manage that, we will have our style. That's the question of style.
This was in these Nietzsche.
It's the Nietzsche lectures, which are about the same time as this.
I'm wondering why he doesn't use the term transcendental. Wouldn't that bring those opposites together?
Transcendental takes him too much in the direction of Kant, which he doesn't like.
And that's why? So it was a conscious sort of mission of how, I mean, that would
That's
have
a
been
major
pathway.
philosophical word, so these kinds of gestures on Heidegger's part are very calculated.
They are.
Very.
Okay.
Okay, maybe what we should do is, I'll take one more question, then we'll take a break, because I still haven't started the text. Haven't started the front door anyway, I've got to the back.
Just to revisit the political question, I'm very sympathetic to your position about the over-politicization of the academy. But I wonder, how do you reconcile that position with the fact that what is political is the uncovering of what has never been said, as you were saying, and that the most common kind of trope for keeping what has never been said from being said is by labeling it overly political. So that's kind of often what keeps things from being said, or keeps it from rising to the surface when it is being said.
Let me understand what you're saying now. I mean, that's a trope I recognize in the way people would respond to claims of gay rights, for example. In the sense that you're making this too special, or you're insisting too much on something that we accept anyway. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that would be.
Or do you have other thoughts and other examples?
I mean, any struggle for power, I would say, or struggle with power, one of the main tropes used by people with power has been calling the discourse of those uncovering what's never been said as political.
Yeah.
And so, I'm curious because it's difficult to. I can see the other position you're saying, the political, concentrating on the political for its own sake is very problematic and makes politics impossible. But then that discourse is used in a very tricky way very often.
Yes. I'm entirely sympathetic with what you're saying. I'm just having a little trouble figuring out how to engage it. I mean, Rancière talks about politics in the sense you're describing. That the political act is constituting a point of confrontation or negotiation which hasn't existed before, because the one, and Lyotard talks in these terms as well when he talks about the different and how one constitutes a political relation. The difficulty is that a particular let's just say a way of being doesn't have a political voice, and so the political act is precisely when it takes form over against the hegemonic or the dominant position. So, yes, and my question then, I'd say, okay, yes, that would be I mean, to contest the terms in which to contest the terms in which the political order themselves defined is a political act, along the lines you're describing. The question I'm asking is whether the demand that this other way of being be recognized within a political framework doesn't precisely reduce some of those dimensions of experience that I'm talking about. And so, I suppose we're talking about the way in which the limits are constituted and constantly in motion. And what I'm asking is whether the definition, if we understand the definition of limits to always be a political act, whether that's not in itself, in some sense, reductive. Right? Is all meaning political meaning? Is the question I'm asking. Is it, and what is the status of those dimensions of experience that don't quite reach meaning? Political meaning. Be that in the conflict of one group with another group, an emergent group or a suppressed group with another group. I think what I'm asking about is the hegemony of the notion of the political, and what might that be foreclosing in itself? I'm very sympathetic with what that way of thinking about politics that you're saying, but I'm wondering whether that still doesn't. Again, the question I really would like to discuss with Monsieur is, what do you mean by political? More. I mean, I haven't been able to study his text enough. My wife, who's around, has been addressing this question.
I don't find political though. I'm in the academy and it's completely apolitical. I'm in the English department, and when people are taught literary theory, they're taught all of these guys that we're studying without any political context to them at all, right? Without any reason why the code,
Where do you?
I'm in Canada.
In Canada.
Aren't you talking about the political within the academy of why you even have to study those guys?
And everyone in my department, they don't. I mean, whatever. I just think it's a reductionist to say that in order to be successful in academic, you have to be political. I mean, there's so much political in terms of what Chris is saying in terms of what's not said. Right? There's something. That's what's political is what's not said. I don't believe that, particularly in this neoliberal, hegemony. I guess when we use the word hegemony of academy now, I don't believe it's the same thing, and I think it's a reductionist.
I mean, certainly. I'll tell you, I live in Aberdeen, and I have an experience like yours with the English department, and I would say, that's precisely what makes this English department so extraordinarily provincial. They're really quite out of touch with what's happening in most of the world, let alone London. But just look at the people who dominate theoretical discourse in the literary world. Look at the people who are here and the way they speak. I mean, we have a collection of some of the most important literary theorists or philosophers who influence literary theory anywhere. Badiou is a political thinker. Judy Butler, she's a political thinker. Jacques, most of his thinking is politically oriented. And those are the stars. Those are the ones who take the forefront of the stage, because they are raising questions about literature and experience and philosophy, which have political import, and they're able to articulate these political questions in very commanding and compelling ways. I have no problems with what they're doing. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but what I'm saying is that this is what is brought into prominence and what defines the standards and the values within the academy. This is my experience. I mean, yes, it's true that there are all kinds of things going on in the academy, but when it comes to, I might say, symbolic authority within within those institutions that are defining what counts and what doesn't count, my experience that the reference to political is overriding. Now, I think this has to do with the fact that the humanities are increasingly unable to define their place within the academic institution. And it has to do with the crisis of the humanities themselves. And so this reaching out to the public sphere to try to justify the humanistic activity in relation to what counts, publicly. It says this is a symptom of the fact that humanists are unable to define why the work with language has a place in the academy. So we have a construction of the academy frequently which sees it as isolated in relation to the real world, and the humanists who are getting killed in the contemporary technical scientific order of things, which is also how money flows, try to justify their presence by reaching to this outside, and hence the determination of humanistic work as having political meaning is in part symptomatic of this crisis of the humanities, because we don't know how to justify what the humanities are.
I think it was more applicable like what Wolfgang said the other night about how we should, were you there when he said how we should think about political philosophy? Yeah, the political philosophy itself is too small, right? It's like, what, are we all going to look to Schmidt and he's going to be our, he's our good guy, our bad guy, good guy? Like, it's like there's, and I think there's other ways of thinking about the political in terms of like, everything is political, everything's not political, or identity. I mean, anyway.
I think I find it really helpful Hannah Arendt's understanding of the political and the human condition when she presents it. My understanding is basically a privilege, and it's something that you are invited to engage in after you take care of all of the needs of your body and your life. And so that the political, rather than being sort of its obligation, is actually an opportunity. And in Rancière's work, what I understood from his sense of the political is that it's something that's also always available and not necessarily part of what the state puts out there. And so that it's sort of your political action can always run parallel to what the man is doing, so to speak. And so that it's actually a challenge to find your space to be able to express that alongside what everything else is doing. So that the idea of like having some big revolution or something is not actually the point, as much as it is that you just express your truth in everything you do in your life, and that is your political act. So,
well, this is, I think what you're pointing to, what I was saying, we need to find ways to talk about the political that allow for, I think, greater freedom with the term, and to limit some of the more accepted senses of what is political and what is not. I think Rancière is making some very important contributions there.
I mean, I think what both of them put out there is that the political doesn't have to be me against you.
Doesn't have to be, I'm sorry?
Me against you.
Yeah.
The political doesn't have to be an opposition, an opposing force. And that it can be just this creative force and emotions and the sense of producing something. And the political really is much more just the actual engagement that happens. It's not to the end of some assertion of the truth or of an agenda. It's just more of the process, and Hannah Arendt goes back to a Greek forum a lot in that sense of when you can leave your house and enter into the political realm. That's really a practice. That's what we're here for. So it's to not address that and to not participate in it seems almost like you're not being fully responsible in what is given to you. Not that you have to, but that it's almost like you can't live without being political, or else you're going to be on a mountaintop by yourself. And even that, you're still dependent upon some political engagement, like who built the road up there, all of that is political in some level because it means engaging with other people.
And there an important word is public, it seems to me, with the way you're using the term. The concern that I'm trying to address in part is my question would be in relation to what you said is, to what extent have we in fact been summoned to be political in the sense that you've described? That is to say, to find ourselves creatively in the public space and to articulate that, to craft it, to realize it in various ways. To what extent does our socio-political is socio-political existence demanding such a performance? To what extent are we, to use Judy Butler's word, interpolated in that? Because if what we take to be a free act has in fact been commanded of us, then in fact it's not so free. And an awful lot of the idea of free expression, which has been going on since the 60s and before, is very much, I sense, is at a certain command, right? Is performing for a particular notion of the public and a particular understanding of the political. And sometimes that can be seen as an anarchic performance. But in fact, it's performing in relation to a requirement to be public in certain ways. And if that isn't, in fact, an interpolated behavior, then it's not as free as might be conceived. And perhaps we need to understand, perhaps we need to rescue the notion of freedom to some extent. Because it could be we're all on a stage which culture is in some sense programming for us. And
culture or capital?
I'm sorry?
Culture or capital?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't mean to be, I'm not taking a strong position here, but I'm telling you why I'm so worried about this watchword, everything is political. Because it is precisely employed by those with whom I'm in utter sympathy, who are trying to bring forth, forms of experience and ways of living which have been repressed or suppressed. But I fear that the way in which it is brought forward can fall prey to you might say, the public staging, which has already been programmed for us, and even as we think we are challenging it. And so the issue is how do we really think our freedom and live it? And I'm not being pretentious and offering another political position here. I'm simply saying I think maybe there are dimensions of experience, of human experience, and also dimensions of this staging that we need to think about a little bit more. How this theater is constructed within our capitalist societies, within the media, and within culture, what we understand to be culture, and expression, and self-expression, and so forth. All of these terms all of these forms are heavily coded, and we need to find ways to challenge those codings. Perhaps to release other things. I'm not taking, I try to phrase things strongly in order to get my point across, but I'm not trying to pretend to occupy some other position in this respect. Except insofar as I say, I think that if you want to be political, don't try so hard to be political. Make something happen that perhaps doesn't answer to this script. That's all I'm trying to say. Okay, well, it's past 11:30. Let's pause and then come back.